way. Okay. So the first chapter deals with the endocrine system, which is one of the two communication networks in the body along with the nervous system, but it uses different tools, right? It uses structures that are called endocrine glands and chemical signals that are called hormones, which are secreted into the blood by active transport and then carried around the body by the beating action of the heart. And they are only going to interact with target tissues that have receptors for those particular chemical signals. Okay. They'll drift by everything else and will have no impact on them. All right. So that's how the targets are defined. The endocrine system is a bit slower than the nervous system. The targets are wider and the effects usually last longer. The hormones come in two broad categories. There are hydrophobic and hydrophilic hormones. Hydrophilic hormones can travel in the bloodstream by themselves. They're cool. A hydrophobic hormone, because it doesn't mix well with water, which is a lot of what plasma is going to end up as being carried through the blood, usually by a transport protein. Okay. It might be something like a chylomicron. It might be a transport protein that wraps around the hormone in order to drop it off. And then they're called transport globulins. Okay. But then once we get to our desired location, we drop that payload off. And the result of that is that hydrophobic hormone, instead of acting at the surface of the target tissue, is actually going to slide through the membrane, and the receptors are actually inside the target, usually in the cytoplasm of the nucleus. And then that complex is going to go to the DNA, latch on to specific genes, cause them to be transcribed, and then those messages will be translated, and that will serve as the response to that chemical signal. So hydrophobic hormones generally take longer to do their work than hydrophilic hormones, which generally work at the membrane surface and use something called a cascade to do their job. Okay. And so you might wonder, okay, well, what are the hydrophobic hormones? And let's just real quick make this easy, right? The hydrophobic hormones are, let's say hydrophobic. Okay. T3 and T4, which is thyroxine and triiodothyronine, and they're made by the thyroid gland. Okay. And then any steroid hormone. Okay. So some examples would be testosterone, aldosterone, cortisol, cortisone, estrogen, progesterone. Okay. That's it. Okay. And every other hormone is going to be hydrophilic. Okay. So that makes things a little bit easier, I think, to work with. An endocrine gland gets its name because it is ductless. Okay. No duct. No duct. Okay. So it uses active transport to do its work. While an exocrine gland has a duct. The duct is like a pipe. Okay. And they generate their material, and then that goes through the pipe into an organ or onto a surface. Okay. So you might wonder, okay, give me some examples of an exocrine gland. Sweat glands, mammary glands, okay, sebaceous glands, oil glands in your skin. And then there are some glands that are both endocrine and exocrine, and those include things like the pancreas and the gonads. Okay. So these are both exocrine and endocrine. Okay. There are also some glands or tissues that serve as paracrines or autocrines. Okay, a paracrine secretion is one that's going to hit a nearby set of cells and cause a response, and an autocrine secretion actually has an impact on the cell that originally secreted it. Okay, so that's a little unusual, but there you go. All right. The only reason that the endocrine gets that special designation is because the target is quite some distance from the gland that's going to signal it. Okay. You have to travel through the blood to qualify as an endocrine signal. So we can start with a look at the different types of glands. You'll notice that in an endocrine gland, because it uses active transport to deliver its payload to its target, there's going to be a lot of blood vessels in it. So all endocrine glands are going to be very vascular. Right? That means has blood vessels. See something there, right? An exocrine gland is going to rely on a duct, right? You can see the duct here in order to get the product to its final destination. And so there will be blood vessels around, but they're not necessary for the delivery of the payload, okay? And so you can see here, they're actually showing you a sweat gland, a sudiferous gland, right? So different methods of secretion for exocrine glands as well that we'll learn about a little bit later, okay? So we talked earlier about the nervous system and the endocrine system, but they're both communication, okay? They're both for communication. And the main thing that they're trying to communicate is how to maintain homeostasis. Okay. That's the big thing, all right? The nervous system uses neurotransmitters at chemical synapses to jump tiny gaps between the nerve cell and the target. The endocrine system is using those tools called hormones in the bloodstream as a delivery method, okay? And then it talks down here about, again, some of the things we've already discussed, right? The speed of the action, the scope of the target, right? And how long it lasts, the duration, okay? Now, you might wonder, well, so why do we need two communication networks? It's kind of a good question, right? The nervous system is so great at doing what it does. Why do we need an endocrine system? And it's kind of an interesting answer, right? The nervous system, number one, uses lots of energy, uses a lot of energy, okay? Okay. And the other thing about the nervous system is it needs to travel to the target, right? It has to have a way to actually walk through the body and get pretty close to the target. And that happens on nerves, right? Which are bundles of axons that eventually get to the target. And that's where you dump the neurotransmitter and make the target do its thing, right? Well, if we did that for every cell in the body, number one, our energy use would go through the roof, right? We'd have to be eating all the time in order to maintain just homeostasis. And the other problem is logistical, right? It would be difficult to wire every cell in the body up to the central nervous system. Okay. So we had to have a way, a low tech way and a low energy way to communicate stuff in the body so that we didn't have those problems. And that's why the endocrine system evolved. Okay? And the endocrine system was probably an earlier arrival than the nervous system. okay? Because back early in evolution, there really wasn't a nervous system to speak of, but there were responses to the environment that involved chemical interaction, okay, like positive and negative chemotaxis. And that really is sort of an elaboration of how the endocrine system works, okay? The nervous system didn't come along until we got to multicellular organisms, and only then it slowly developed, right? So you can see here, again, a comparison, right? The endocrine system is precise because only the target cells with the proper receptor can respond to the hormone. And target cells with particular receptors are going to be defined as the targets. Those without the receptors aren't going to be responsive, right? Because there's nowhere for the signal to grip. And so there's nowhere to affect a change on a cell that doesn't have a receptor for it, okay? That said, there is an interesting phenomenon, right? Sort of like in the nervous system. If you overload the endocrine system's communication with its target, right? The target can become less sensitive to that hormone by downregulating the receptor, right? And the same thing happens if you don't produce as much hormone to the target. The amount of receptor for the target can actually increase in an effort to try and see that chemical signal. Okay, so the target is alive, aware of what's talking to it. The endocrine glands are shown here, and they're pretty straightforward, right? We have the real master gland, right, is the hypothalamus. Okay, the hypothalamus is going to direct the actions of the pituitary, which in turn will direct the actions of the thyroid. It'll direct the actions of the adrenal cortex. It will address the reactions of the gonads, okay? So all of that is the responsibility of the hypothalamus working through the pituitary, okay? In addition, the pituitary has two lobes, an anterior and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is glandular tissue, and it gets chemical signals from the hypothalamus that travel through the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary kicks out the appropriate hormone. But the posterior pituitary is actually an outgrowth of the brain, and its two hormones are ADH and oxytocin. Okay. Okay. And ADH targets the kidneys, right? And oxytocin targets smooth muscle in the breasts and in the uterus. Okay. ADH also has a name, vasopressin, and it's your water retaining hormone. Oxytocin promotes milk ejection, uterine contraction, and bonding between mother and child. There's just a few of its effects. But those hormones are literally manufactured in the hypothalamus and then stored in the posterior pituitary. Okay. So there's your hypothalamus and pituitary, right? Your thyroid gland is a target of the anterior pituitary. A hormone called TSH is produced by the anterior pituitary, and it causes the thyroid gland to kick out T3 and T4, okay, which is thyroxine and a hormone called triiodothyronine. And what they do is they raise your metabolic rate, okay? So the idea there is that your basal metabolic rate is the speed with which your body burns your fat reserves at rest. And when you produce a lot of thyroid hormone, what'll happen is that you'll burn that stuff more rapidly to use for energy. And when you're producing less thyroid hormone, the metabolic rate goes down, and you're going to store and retain more body fat. Okay. So that's two big parts of your thyroid, right? T3, T4, right? There's another hormone that thyroid makes called calcitonin. Okay, and calcitonin responds to calcium levels in the blood. And the idea is that calcitonin causes a reduction in blood calcium so that it goes back into the bone. Okay, so the way I remember that is calcitonin puts the tone in the bone. Right. The adrenal glands really have two parts, right? There's a cortex and there's a medulla. Okay. The medulla is actually part of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and it generates epinephrine, which you can also call adrenaline, epinephrine. Okay. While the cortex is going to produce hormones that affect salt balance, sugar levels in the blood, as well as inflammation. Okay. And then finally, it'll be a source of sex hormones. Okay. So the way to remember the adrenal cortex is to remember the mnemonic salt, sugar, sex, right? The salt hormone is aldosterone. And that is your salt retaining hormone. So when aldosterone is made, you hold on to more sodium and more water. And so it causes blood pressure and blood volume to go up. Okay. And it also causes you to lose potassium, right? And then your sugar hormone is cortisone or cortisol. There's several of them in there in the middle of the cortex. Okay. And cortisone raises blood glucose levels and suppresses inflammation. Okay. It's a stress hormone. And then finally, the sex hormones are androgens. Okay. And they are a lot like testosterone in their effect. Okay. And testosterone effects are to increase muscle mass, increase hematocrit, okay, and then also to increase bone density. And increase libido, which is sex drive. Okay. This is one of the reasons that athletes sometimes abuse androgens in an effort to become bigger, stronger, and faster, because all of these androgens, testosterone included, will do this. Okay. And then we have pancreas, which makes two hormones, insulin and glucagon, and they control blood sugar levels. Okay. Insulin is hypoglycemic, so it drops blood sugar levels, and glucagon is hyperglycemic, so it raises blood sugar levels. Okay. And then there's other hormones. The thymus produces thymosins and thymopoietins, and so that aids the immune system, helps white blood cells develop and do their job. Okay. And then there are hormones made by things like the heart. Okay. The heart makes A&P, which is an antagonist to aldosterone, right? So the heart causes you to lose blood volume and blood pressure by losing more sodium. Okay. And then there are hormones in the digestive system that we'll talk more about when we get there. Hormones that are actually made by adipose tissue. And there are hormones that are produced in even in the respiratory system. Okay. And you've got down here the gonads, right? Gonads, of course, the hormones are testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Okay. Men and women make all three, but men make more testosterone, right? And women make more estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and so those are our gonad hormones. Those are gonads, right? The testes and the ovaries. Okay? So what's neat about this is it really is like a hierarchy, right? The hypothalamus talks to the pituitary talks to its targets, and then those targets create a response, and then that's ultimately going to feed back to the hypothalamus and pituitary, and through negative feedback, it's going to turn down or turn off the original command. Okay? Hormones are released into the extracellular spaces around the endocrine cells, and they diffuse into the blood, and then they go around the body, right? And you can see a list of the different hormones here. I won't go through every one, okay? But just know that this is a table in your book that talks about um, the gland that releases the hormone, the name of the hormone, the abbreviation, and the synonym, okay? So this is something that you want to sort of tuck under your belt, right? Note that with the hypothalamus, right, all of the hormones here are either going to, in the case of the posterior pituitary, they have direct targets outside the pituitary gland, but in the anterior pituitary, with the exception of human growth hormone, HGH, right, um, your targets are going to be all within the anterior pituitary, right? So this targets the anterior pituitary, so does this, so does this, so does this, okay? So does this, okay? So does that, and so does that. Those all target anterior pituitary, right? And then the anterior pituitary is going to target mostly other organs, right? Adrenocorticotrophic is going to target the adrenal cortex. Follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone are going to target the gonads. Prolactin and is going to target the breasts. Growth hormone targets the muscle tissue, the connective tissue, um, and epithelial tissue throughout the body. Okay, and it just causes growth. And then thyroid stimulating hormone obviously hits the thyroid. Okay, and your posterior pituitaries, their targets are very different, right? Their targets are not other endocrine organs. They are other organs, right? So ADH, the target is the kidneys, okay? And oxytocin, smooth muscle, SM, smooth muscle in breasts and uterus. Okay. We've talked about calcitonin and thyroxine and triiodothyronine, what they do. Parathyroid hormone is going to increase calcium levels in the blood. So it is an antagonist to calcitonin, right? So it responds to reduced blood calcium levels. Epinephrine and norepinephrine really target the whole body because they are actually helpers for the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. Okay. So the idea here is that when you panic, right, not only are you going to cause the sympathetic autonomic nervous system to release epinephrine on its targets and induce fight or flight, but the adrenal medulla fires at the same time. And the result is that the effects of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system take longer to wear off because it's tougher to clear adrenaline out of the blood than it is other neurotransmitters. Adrenal cortex, right? There's our salt, sugar, sex, right? Salt, sugar, sex, right? Sorry. Where's our, it doesn't list the androgens. Well, the androgens are here. We'll just put them in. That's the sex part. Okay. So this is your salt retaining hormone. Retaining. Okay. This elevates blood sugar. It suppresses inflammation. Okay. Then we got the pancreas, right? Glucagon and insulin. Glucagon raises blood sugar. Insulin lowers blood sugar. Okay. And somatostatin is an antagonist to growth hormone. Okay. So it has the opposite effects of what growth hormone does, which is to cause growth and synthesis. Okay. Growth hormone also happens to be a performance enhancing drug, just like testosterone and androgens. Okay, so all used by athletes to get bigger and stronger. And then we talk about the different types of hormones, hydrophobic hormones here, right, which have to travel bound to transport globulins in the blood. Whoops, sorry. Transport globulins, because they don't mix with water, which is most of what plasma is. Okay, so it lists all those, and then we should, put in here that T3 and T4, although they're not steroid hormones, are also hydrophobic. Okay, so steroid and steroid-like hormones and T3 and T4. Okay, and then non-steroid hormones are everything else, right? So I think that makes it easier, right? If you just know what the hydrophobic hormones are, you know how they act, and you know everything else is hydrophilic, and so you know how it's going to act, right? So you can see the different types of hormones and the compounds, right? How they're derived, and some examples of each, okay? And the structures, right? So you might wonder, okay, hydrophobic here. Okay. And then they're going to show you, not going to show you T3 and T4. But this is hydrophobic because if you look at it, if you survey it, the bulk of the structure is carbon-hydrogen bonds or carbon-carbon bonds. Okay. Which means that the bulk of the molecule is going to have an even distribution of electrons across its surface, which means that it's going to prefer to be with other things that are also hydrophobic. Another way to think of hydrophobic is think of it as greasy. Okay? Greasy things like greasy things. Okay. And polar or charged things like to be with each other. Okay. So those are different categories, right? All these others are hydrophilic. All right. So how do hormones do their work? Well, they hit their receptor. The receptor changes its shape, and then the receptor, in the case of a hydrophobic hormone, is going to move to the nucleus and open up and transcribe certain genes along with RNA polymerase, and then that'll be translated into protein, and that will serve as the response. In the case of the other hormones, the hydrophilic ones, they're going to bind receptor on the surface of the target. The receptor will change shape, and the result will be what we call a cascade of chemical reactions, cascade, that will result in ultimately a response. Okay. Okay. And you might wonder, what do you mean by a cascade? Well, okay. If you think back to when you were little, there used to be a game called freeze tag, where the idea was to touch everybody and freeze them solid, right? And if you did that, you won. Well, you could think of a cascade as like reverse freeze tag. You're it. Anybody you touch is it. Anybody they touch is it. And pretty soon everybody's it, right? So the way a cascade works is that you have receptor binding the ligand hormone. So the receptor, right? There's hormone. that sets into action a chemical reaction where an inactive molecule becomes an active molecule, and another inactive molecule becomes an active molecule, and another inactive molecule becomes an active molecule, and so on. And finally, you get to the last molecule, whatever that is, we'll call it X, right? And that molecule is going to be the one that really sets up the response. It might open ion channels, it might release ions inside the cell or let ions come into the cell. It might close certain gates in membrane proteins. There's any number of things that this last one can do. But the reason that the cascade is used is because it's fast, okay? And it amplifies the signal. Okay, and if you amplify the signal, it's more effective. And it's also easy to turn off, so it can be regulated, right? Because with a cascade, all you have to do is stop maybe the first or second steps in the cascade, and then the whole thing will turn off, right? And then there are enzymes running around that'll deactivate everything else that's been activated, okay? So that's how the hormones do their work, right? Upregulation is the increase in the number of receptors on the target because hormone levels drop, and downregulation, the reduction in receptors because hormone levels are too high for too long. We already talked about that as well. Okay. Steroid hormones can diffuse through the lipid bilayer because they are hydrophobic, as is thyroid hormone. Now, thyroid hormone is unusual. It has iodine as part of its structure, but the iodine atoms are placed in the structure of the thyroid hormone so that there's an even distribution of electrons across the surface of the molecule. So it's hydrophobic, okay? It's nonpolar. So the receptors are inside the target cells for a hydrophobic hormone, okay? So you can see the sequence of responses here for steroid hormone action, or you could really cross this out and say hydrophobic. As it goes for thyroid hormone too, right? Endocrine gland kicks out the hormone, blood carries the hormone throughout the body, and let's say in a transport globulin, a protein, okay, right? Steroid hormone is going to go right through the target cell membrane and enter the cytoplasm or the nucleus, where a receptor will find it. And then the complex binds DNA and starts transcription. The message leaves the nucleus and translation begins, and then the proteins produce the effect, right? And you can see all of that here, okay? Sequence of events. And this is one of the reasons why you should always be very careful of stuff that's hydrophobic, okay? Hydrophobic things can go, hydrophobic molecules can travel anywhere in the body, including the central nervous system. Okay. So you might know of a drug called LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, is a hydrophobic hallucinogen that was popular in the 60s, and people would take it on sugar cubes, or they would put it on the surface of their eye using it in a form called window pane, and it would diffuse right through the skin, right into the blood, right through the blood, right into the tissue fluid, right through the tissue fluid, and then right into the central nervous system. And then it would cause hallucinations. Okay, it's very effective. And for the longest time, people that were using it thought that, they could drop acid, and when they stopped dropping the acid, the effects would go away. But what they didn't realize is that we have an infinite capacity for hydrophobic storage in the body, right? And so we can store things like LSD in our myelin or in our adipose tissue, right? And a lot of it. And then it can pop out later and exert its effects, okay? Other examples of harmful hydrophobic molecules include tetraethyl lead, which used to be an additive in gasoline. Ethyl would be, yeah, ethyl's 2, right? Tetraethyl lead, 2, right? Just 2. Tetraethyl lead like this. Eraser out here. Tetraethyl lead. Oh, okay, you got it. Tetraethyl lead. Oh, it's yellow. Red. And tetraethyl lead. Tetra means 4. These are ethyl groups, right? Used to be an additive in gasoline, used to be in lead paint. And for some reason, back when this was used, lead paint tasted good to children. And so they'd eat the lead paint, the lead would get into their blood and they'd get it in their brain, and it would interfere with the action of neurons. And so they would start doing poorly on standardized tests, okay? Same thing with the leaded gasoline, right? So it's a neurotoxin, okay? Another example is elemental mercury, right? There was a time when mercury was used to treat hat bands in the 17 and 1800s, okay? And the hatters, the haberdashers, would try on the hats with the hat bands in them, right? The hatters, and they would absorb the mercury into their skin and into their brain. And that's where you get the character, the Mad Hatter, from Alice in Wonderland. It's a real thing, okay? Okay. Again, mercury is a neurotoxin. Okay, we used to use mercury in thermometers. We don't anymore. But whenever you'd swallow mercury, we would work real hard to try and get you to throw it up by giving you drugs called emetics. Okay. Okay. Non-steroid hormones are going to work at the surface of their target, right? So you're going to have the endocrine gland kick out the hydrophilic hormone. It'll bind with the receptor on the membrane surface. And in some cases, the next participant there is something called adenylate cyclase, right? Which manufactures something called cyclic A&P, okay? And then what'll happen with cyclic A&P, if it's the second messenger, it'll activate protein kinases, which phosphorylate proteins, and that activates them. And then the metabolism of that cell will change because of these activated proteins, and that qualifies as the hormone effect. And this is all a cascade. Okay. Cascade. So you can see here how this works, right? Here's our game of reverse freeze tag. I tag you, you wiggle, you change the state of the G protein, which tags the adenylate cyclase, because this just kind of shuffles across the membrane and hits it. The adenylate cyclase makes the cyclic A&P, which then activates protein kinases, and then they cause the cellular change. You might say, well, it looks like every step is just a single deal, right? But that's not the case, okay? Because one G protein can hit many adenylate cyclases. Many cyclic A&Ps are produced, and all of those can hit multiple protein kinases that are inactive. The active protein kinases can activate many other targets, and the result is the amplification of the signal. Okay, so this is the cascade, like a waterfall, right? So it's rapid and it amplifies everything. Okay. That's why it's used. Some examples, right? Steroids to increase muscular strength. Those are going to have a problem, right? If you take, okay, let's take the example of testosterone, right? That's the traditional anabolic steroid, right? So you take testosterone through a needle, right? The testosterone is going to have the effects desired, right? It's going to jack your crit. That's the number of red blood cells per unit volume of plasma, right? It's going to jack your muscle mass. If you exercise, you have to exercise, okay? And it's going to jack your bone density, okay? And it's going to jack your libido, okay? But because it's hydrophobic, okay, it can also go into your brain, or it can cause episodes you probably have heard of as roid rage. Okay. And it can suppress the production of the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which suppresses the production of LH and FSH. Okay. And the result of that is that the testicles, the gonads, let's say, the gonads atrophy. Okay. So when you go off taking your anabolic steroid through a needle, you have very little source of natural testosterone, and you will actually see the emergence in men of female secondary sex characteristics. Okay, such as breast growth, loss of axial and body hair, loss of muscle mass and crit and bone density, okay, etc. Okay, so that's you're paying the price, right? If you overuse something, it'll hypertrophy, and it could end up getting damaged. If you underuse something, it will atrophy, right? It's your body's way of saying if you don't use it, you lose it, right? Growth hormone, right? Used to enlarge muscles, can be used along with steroids, right? But growth hormone, all right, growth hormone, if you increase the amount of growth hormone too much, right, after the end of puberty, you end up with a condition called acromegaly, okay, where you get enlarged hands and feet, facial features, okay. Think Andre the Giant. From The Princess Bride, okay. He had two conditions. He had both acromegaly and gigantism, which is caused if growth hormone is secreted prior to the end of puberty, right? So gigantism. Okay. Most of the people that hold the Guinness Book of World Records for tallest man were pituitary giants because they overproduced human growth hormone prior to the end of puberty. And it actually causes lots of complications throughout the body, aside from just being very, very big. Okay. So again, these are powerful chemical signals. Erythropoietin, or EPO, high EPO causes high hematocrit. Okay, so your blood gets thicker, right? So you have more oxygen carrying capacity. So you can beat the pants off of people in endurance events that aren't using EPO, right? You can take EPO through a needle, and you can cheat your way through a lot of events. Now, this is what busted Lance Armstrong, right? They found out that he was taking EPO to win all these Tour de France's, so he got stripped of everything. Turns out that a lot of the other cyclists were doing the same thing, but cheating's cheating. But you can increase your EPO naturally if you train at high altitudes, right? You train at high altitudes. Train at high altitudes. And because of the low oxygen in the air, reduced oxygen in the air, your kidneys kick out more EPO, right? And that causes your crit to go up, right? There's your high crit again, okay? And then when you go down to sea level, you can beat the pants off of everybody in any sporting event that requires extensive endurance. And that's legit. You're allowed to do that, okay? You just can't take it through a needle. This is why over many seasons, right, the Denver Broncos, the Colorado Avalanche, the Denver Nuggets, and so on, Colorado Rockies, they have the best home records compared to other teams that play at sea level because they train at high altitudes, and as a result, they have better endurance at high altitudes, okay, than the teams that come from sea level up into the mountains to try to play, right? They get tired late in the game and they could end up losing. Prostaglandins are paracrines that are potent in tiny amounts. They aren't stored in cells. They're made right before they're kicked out. They inactivate quickly, and they regulate responses to hormones, and they can either activate or inhibit adenylate cyclase, which will either raise or lower cyclic A&P production. They have a lot of different effects. They can contract or relax smooth muscle. They can stimulate or inhibit secretion. They can regulate blood pressure and control movement of water and sodium into the kidneys and can promote inflammation, right? Hormone secretion is primarily controlled by negative feedback, all right? So the idea is you have your endocrine gland, right, responds to a stimulus, right? Okay. The gland kicks out a hormone or kicks out a hormone. And hormone. Okay. Hormone gets to the target. Target responds. And then it creates conditions that hit the original gland and shut down this pathway. Okay. And that's negative feedback, right? Effects can be a few minutes or a few days. The secretions of hormones are regulated, and they are usually kicked out in the urine after they've done their work, and they're broken down by enzymes in the liver in order to reduce their effects. One of the jobs of the liver, okay, is to convert hydrophobic to hydrophilic compounds, right? And these could be drugs, hormones, whatever. And then what happens is that once these get to the kidney loses them in the urine, okay? And so they're gone, right? For hormones that are already hydrophilic, they just go straight in to the filtrate that becomes the urine, and they get cleared that way, right? So this is one of the reasons why if people drink extensively early in their lives and they damage their liver through a process called inflammation and cirrhosis, okay, later on, frequently, if we have to give them a drug in order for them to overcome a particular medical condition, sometimes we can't administer the drug because the extra work the liver would have to do would cause the liver to fail, right? And if the liver fails, you die, right? That's why the first four letters of the word liver spell live. That's not a coincidence. Okay. So kind of interesting. Okay, negative feedback, right? We've got some different ways of controlling hormone secretion, right? Tropic hormones hit other glands and regulate their hormone production. There are some that are controlled directly by the nervous system, such as the adrenal medulla and the hypothalamus. And then sometimes we have a change in blood chemistry, and that's called humoral control, right? And the idea there is that they respond to a shift in the blood of, say, sugar concentration or sodium concentration or the osmolarity of the blood, and they kick out the hormone that counteracts that change. Okay. So you can see some differences here, right? Hypothalamus talks to anterior pituitary, which hits another endocrine organ, hits the target, the action happens, right? And then once the action has been affected, right, that's going to create conditions that will suppress the original command, right? Down here, you've got the nervous system as a direct hookup to the endocrine gland that hits the target, that causes the action, and that immediately feeds back to that nervous input. Okay, and this is going to be adrenal cortex, or sorry, adrenal medulla. Hypothalamus, and pineal gland. And we could also put in here posterior pituitary. Okay. They're all controlled via the nervous system. Okay. And then changes in the internal environment, or sometimes called humoral regulation. We get a change in blood chemistry. It hits the endocrine gland, kicks out the hormone that gets to the target, and then the target does the work of putting the blood chemistry back where it needs to be, and then the endocrine gland will shut down or shut off. Okay. All negative feedback, right? Negative feedback. Feedback. Thank you. Okay. All of these. Positive feedback is rare, okay, in the body. So again, you can just see examples of negative feedback here, right? Basically, again, the stimulus results in a command that is going to produce conditions that are going to counteract the stimulus. That's the bottom line, right? So you can see that hormone concentrations are going to oscillate in between a window, right? And you don't want to go above or below that window, because if you do, you create disease, right? And if you get way too far outside that window, you can produce death, okay? Just like any other homeostatic variable, okay? So the pituitary gland is at the base of the brain, suspended from the hypothalamus by a stalk called the infundibulum, okay? There's two parts. There's an anterior and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is glandular tissue, and the posterior lobe is neurosecretory tissue. Okay. So they look real different under the microscope. And then if we see it here, you can see that it's in the cella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So it's well protected right below the hypothalamus. There's your hypothalamus. There's your anterior and posterior pituitary. Okay. And then there's your sphenoidal sinus. Your nasal cavity is right anterior to it. Okay. And sometimes if we have to do surgery on the pituitary gland, one of the things we do is we actually go through the nose and we crack through the sphenoid bone and we can remove things like a pituitary tumor. Okay. That's called transsphenoidal vitrectomy. Very big word. Okay. But it's kind of nice that the pituitary gland is so well protected because it's pretty darn important. Okay. So the anterior lobe is going to be connected to the hypothalamus by the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, which is just a connected network of capillaries that allows stuff secreted by the hypothalamus to quickly reach the anterior pituitary without having to circulate through the whole body. Right. And then those releasing or inhibiting hormones cause the kick out of the appropriate anterior pituitary hormone. Okay. In the posterior pituitary, nerve impulses hit neurosecretory cells and then they kick their material directly into the blood. And so that's for ADH and oxytocin. So that's neurosecretory. Neurosecretory cells. The hypothalamus controls hormone secretion from the endocrine system through the pituitary gland. Okay. And so the releasing and inhibiting hormones cause the appropriate tissue targets in the anterior pituitary to manufacture their hormone or to reduce production of that hormone. And that changes the levels in the blood and that changes the effect on the target. Okay. So most of the time, it's going to be a peripheral endocrine gland, such as adrenal cortex, the thyroid, or the gonads. Okay. Right? There are some hormones from the anterior pituitary that hit other targets, right? HGH is the whole body. Okay. Prolactin, breasts. Okay. And it's not melatonin, it's shoot, it's escaping. There's one other one that I'm forgetting. It'll come to me. MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. And that gets melanocytes. It's kind of a minor hormone. Yeah. And it's all negative feedback again in order to keep the levels of hormone within a range that is compatible with homeostasis. Okay. So those are the hormones and how they work, right? Growth hormone, right? Obvious growth. Okay. Prolactin, milk production. Come on. Here we go. Milk production. Thyroid stimulating hormone. T3, T4 production. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. Cortisol levels. Okay. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to promote ovulation in females. Okay. Females. And in males, it's going to cause androgen binding protein production, okay, which is going to raise levels of spermatogenesis. Okay. Luteinizing hormone is going to cause the release of progesterone in women, and in men, it's going to cause increase in testosterone production. In guys, okay. And so there you go, right? What it does, what it targets, okay. And there it is, right? Talks about exactly what we just described. Thyroid stimulating hormone secretion is the result of what's called the hypothalamic hypophyseal, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, okay? So the way this works, right, is that what starts this all off is a drop in T3 and T4, okay? That's detected in the blood by the hypothalamus, okay? And that causes the kick out of thyrotropin releasing hormone, which causes the kick out of thyroid stimulating hormone, which then is going to ultimately get to the thyroid and cause the kick out of T3 and T4. Okay. As T3 and T4 levels in the blood rise, we're going to eventually inhibit the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary from producing these hormones. Okay. So sometimes what can happen is that you can have problems with, let's talk about the thyroid since we're on that topic right now. You can have a hyperactive thyroid, or a hypoactive thyroid. Okay. In a hyperactive thyroid, what do you see? You see bulging eyes. That's a condition called exophthalmia. You see goiter. You see, which is a swelling under the chin. You see, in addition to that, sweating and an intolerance to high temperatures, okay, and nervousness and anxiousness, and they're very skinny, okay. All right. In a hypoactive thyroid, you see the opposite. You tend to see sensitivity to cold. You tend to see weight gain. You tend to see high levels of sugar in the blood, okay, and a slow metabolism, all right, and a goiter, okay. So what's going on in each of these cases? Well, in a hyperactive thyroid, it's hyperactive here, you can have a problem at the level of the hypothalamus, you could have a problem at the level of the pituitary gland, or you could have a problem at the level of the thyroid gland, right? It all depends on who's the bad actor, right? If the hypothalamus is messing up and it's jacking levels of TRH, then in the blood, you're going to see high TRH, high TSH, and high thyroid, okay? If, and let's use a different color here, let's go to green. If the problem is with the pituitary gland, all right, then you're going to see high TSH, you're going to see high thyroid, but you're going to see low TRH, okay? And if the problem is with the thyroid gland, let's use blue. Okay. Problem is with the thyroid gland, then you're just going to see high thyroid, you're going to see low TSH and low TRH, right? And so those levels in the blood will tell you where the problem is, right? Where in the command structure the problem is. You could have a tumor in the thyroid, you could have a tumor in the anterior pituitary, or you could have something going on with the hypothalamus. In this case, all three are going to be elevated, okay? The goiter happens because in the case of hyperactive thyroid, it's overstimulated. Okay. So it enlarges. Okay. That's why you get the goiter. In a hypoactive thyroid, it's also overstimulated but unable to meet the demand of the thyroid stimulating hormone. And the result is that it swells up. Okay. So it can't do its job, but the other glands keep pounding on it, demanding it to do its job, and it's incapable. And so it enlarges. Okay. At one time, one of the main reasons for a hypoactive thyroid was low iodine in the diet. You don't have iodine, you can't make T3 and T4. You can't make T3 and T4, then you're going to crank up the levels of TSH and TRH, right? And you're going to keep pounding on this guy, trying in vain to make T3 and T4, okay? But the Morton company that makes salt started putting iodine in the salt, and then the incidence of hypoactive thyroid started to drop. You still see it in third world countries because of lack of iodine in the diet, okay? So that's a relatively simple fix, okay? So here we have some problems with pituitary, right? If you're not making enough HGH, low HGH leads to reduced growth, which leads to dwarfism. Okay. And this is going to be prior to puberty. This is before the epiphyseal plates of the long bones have sealed. All right. So what do we do about that? We give you growth hormone. Okay. Gigantism. Too much growth hormone. So high HGH prior to puberty. Or T. Okay. Results in increased growth. In this case, because the epiphyseal plates haven't sealed, you get very, very tall. Okay. Height makes you 8 feet and so on. Okay. Acromegaly is high HGH after puberty. Okay. That causes an increase in growth, but the pattern is different because longitudinal growth is no longer possible. You get thickening of bone. Okay. And if you want to see examples of that, look at pictures of Andre the Giant. You can also look up an unfortunate gentleman by the name of Rondo Hatton. Okay. He had this condition as a result of damage to his pituitary during World War I. Okay. And he transformed from a normal looking guy into kind of a scary looking guy. And so he got roles in movies where he was the scary guy, right? And he died young, right? But it shows you how potent these hormones are. Posterior pituitary, ADH and oxytocin, right? ADH is going to target the kidneys, okay? And this is going to be your water retaining hormone. Okay, so this is going to increase blood pressure and blood volume. Okay, oxytocin, right? Smooth muscle and the uterus and the mammary glands. Okay, and then bonding with mother and child. Okay. So there it is. There's the skinny on who's doing what, when. Okay, it's in your book. Thyroid gland, right? Production of T3 and T4 requires iodine. And then calcitonin is a whole different guy, and he is going to reduce blood calcium levels. Okay. The follicular cells generate the T3 and T4, and it's stored in the core of the follicle. As a polymer. Okay. And then the parafolliculars make the calcitonin, right? And that's going to be triggered by changes in blood calcium level. Okay. So you can see here where the follicular cells surround the colloid. Colloid is where the T3 and T4 are stored as polymers. Okay. You got extra follicular cells, and there we're going to make the calcitonin. Okay. All right, cool. And here we go with the structure of T3 and T4, right? There's T3, here's T4. And I want you to notice where the iodines are, okay? The placement of the iodines, you just have to take my word for it. The placement of the iodines is such that these guys are nonpolar. I know it's a little counterintuitive because you're seeing lots of electronegative atoms in the structure, right? Like iodine and oxygen and all that. But because of the way they're arranged, we don't have an uneven distribution of electrons across the surface of the molecule. So we are nonpolar, right? Which means that receptors on the targets are inside the cell. Okay. So, and then calcitonin, of course, is more like a standard hormone. It's hydrophilic, right? It shows you again the hormone, the action, the source of control, right? And it talks about hyper and hypothyroidism, right? And it can happen for different reasons. Okay. Hyperthyroid can be a tumor on the thyroid, can be a tumor on the pituitary, could be a problem in the hypothalamus. Another unusual instance of hypothyroid is something called Graves' disease, which is caused by autoantibodies that bind to receptors on the thyroid and lock it in the on position. Okay. And the fix for that is immune suppressants, right? Autoantibodies are these weird things that your body sometimes makes that unfortunately go and they cause, let's see, participants. There we go. They cause the immune system to attack your own tissue. Okay. And we don't really quite understand why this happens. And there are some theories out there, and I'll go through that when we get to the immune system. But for right now, just think of it as an error in immune function. There's a lot of diseases that are like that, like type 1 diabetes. Okay. Type 1 diabetes mellitus. Hashimoto, okay, again, autoantibodies destroying thyroid cells, so the thyroid cells can't work. In infantile hypothyroidism, we can produce a condition that used to be called cretinism. And that is reduced cognitive function. Okay. And that's because T3 and T4 are important for nervous system development. Okay. Hypothyroidism in the adult results in the conditions that we've already talked about. And then simple goiter could be a deficiency of thyroid hormone because of diet, right? No iodine, no T3 and T4. Okay, so the fix is to put the iodine in. And so that's what they look like, right? There's your hyperthyroid. There's the exophthalmia you can see in the eyes. And then there's the infantile hypothyroidism, right? With a cognitive deficit, enlarged tongue, short stature, okay? And then there's a goiter. That's hypothyroidism in the adult, okay? All because, again, the thyroid's being overstimulated. The parathyroids are on the back of the thyroid gland, and they make parathormone. Also sometimes called parathyroid hormone. And what parathormone does is it raises blood calcium. Okay, in response to lowered blood calcium, right? If the parathyroid gland goes nuts and makes too much parathyroid hormone, it can cause early onset osteoporosis, okay? Because the effects of parathormone in the body are to increase calcium reabsorption from bone into blood, from the digestive system into blood, and from the kidneys into the blood, okay? The other thing you can see, in addition to the reduction in bone density, the osteoporosis, is you can see kidney stones. Okay. So there it is, right? Increase the blood calcium levels, decreases phosphate levels, exerts those effects acting on bone, kidney, and intestine. Okay. Vitamin D is critical here. Okay. And it causes the final step in the activation of vitamin D, right? Without which you can't mineralize the bone. This is one of the reasons why if you stay out of the sunlight too much, right, you don't get your skin enough UV, then you can end up with a condition called rickets in children, okay, or in adults, it's called osteomalacia. Okay, so there's parathyroid hormone regulated by calcium levels in the blood, straight up, right? And its antagonist is calcitonin. Okay, so there are the different symptoms, right? Too much or too little, right? So again, you have to act on this quickly because calcium is not just for bone structure, right? Calcium is going to impact muscle contraction, nerve transmission, heart rate, and contractility. Okay. And it's also going to have an effect on membrane potential. Okay. So you mess around too much with calcium, you're really playing with fire. Okay. Body doesn't like to do that. Okay, the adrenal glands or suprarenal glands are on top of each kidney, and it has two parts: adrenal medulla, which is going to make the adrenaline, and the adrenal cortex, which makes those steroid hormones that affect salt balance, sugar balance, and also can have an effect on gonads through androgen production. This is cortisol. This is aldosterone. Okay, so there you go, right? So medulla is neurosecretory tissue. It's part of the sympathetic ANS, as well as the endocrine system. And the cortex is glandular tissue. And produces these guys. Okay. All right. You can see it here, right? So it looks different histologically because it's different tissue, right? You got out here a capsule, which is non-endocrine, okay? Then you've got the glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis, right? GFR, way to remember those. Glomerulosa is aldosterone. Fasciculata is cortisol. And reticularis is androgens. And then medulla, of course, is going to be epinephrine. Okay. So glandular tissue here, and then neurosecretory here. Neurosecretory tissue. Okay. There we are, right? The effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine are the same as fight or flight effects. Okay. There you go. The cortex. What does what? Salt, sugar, sex, right? Salt, sugar, sex. The way to remember, right? And then notice, right? ACTH is going to impact the sugar and the sex part, okay? But there's so little production of these androgens from the adrenal cortex that this really isn't going to be a huge impact on reproductive cycle, okay? So the main thing is the effect on the cortisol, right? The aldosterone is a whole different animal. The aldosterone responds to the sodium and the potassium, primarily the potassium concentration in the blood, okay? And you can see the different zones, right? And why do they have those names? Well, the reticularis, because it has a web-like appearance. Reticulum, web-like, okay? The fasciculata, because of the presence of bundles of cells that look like fascicles, okay? And then the glomerulosa, because of the clusters of cells found in these regions. Okay. Now, an important pathway that we should discuss that's going to come up again when we talk about the circulatory system and the urinary system, okay, is something called the RAAS, okay, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So how does this work? Well, when there is a drop in blood pressure, okay, the kidneys kick out renin, okay? Renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, and then in the lungs, angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2. So what does angiotensin 2 accomplish? Well, angiotensin 2 should be a 2, on the numeral 2. angiotensin 2 causes an increase in ADH, an increase in aldosterone, an increase in thirst, and an increase in vasoconstriction. And all of this causes an increase in blood pressure, which is what we were after in the first place. Okay. So aldosterone causes the increase in blood pressure and blood volume by retaining more sodium, so you retain more water, right? The ADH does it by just causing water retention, by causing the units in the kidneys called nephrons to become more water permeable, so that more water is recovered from what will be the urine and put back into the blood. Okay. And then, of course, the thirst means you're taking more fluid, so the more blood volume you're going to get. And the vasoconstriction just means that you're going to put more squeeze on the fluid that's in there. And the result of that is an increase in the blood pressure. Okay. All right. Well, we're at time now. It's 7. So I'm going to put the rest of this up, okay, from here on out to the end of the discussion. And it will be available in the course content for this chapter as a podcast link, which will pop up on YouTube. Okay. So you guys can access that to help you with the material in chapter 13 that's covered by the quizzes and the exercises and the connect material that you have to complete. Okay. So before we bump out today, does anyone have any questions about what we've talked about?